Hello and welcome to Read Red. Today I have a video that in some ways has been 3 months in the making. For anybody who is a follower of the channel and has seen the last couple of videos, you'll know that I have been uploading some videos that were not comments on specific books. So I've done videos on like annotations and some updates and book hauls. But in those videos, well, firstly, if you have watched those videos, thank you. In those videos, I talked about the fact that the book that I had been reading over the last couple of months was the King James Version Bible. And even though it took me 3 months, I am finally here. I have made it to the end of the King James Bible. It was 1,146 pages in this Collins leather-bound edition. 470 annotation tags, 100 plus hours, I believe I calculated that I spent reading it. But yeah, I set myself the challenge because I took this book overseas with me while traveling, and it was the only book that I took to read. And so yeah, I did a full cover to cover read of the Bible. In my update video where I first mentioned that I was reading the Bible, I said that I wasn't originally going to make a video on it. My plan was sort of just to keep my thoughts and opinions of it to myself and let the reading of the Bible be sort of research, because I did decide to read it just for literary reasons, and I'll get back to that. But and in that video I was sort of up to the major minor prophets of the Old Testament. Around the time when I had gotten into the New Testament, I'd finished the Gospels and I was reading the epistles of Paul. I kind of decided that I did want to make a video on it because I knew that obviously a comprehensive video on the Bible was not, it was never going to be possible, and also it's the Bible, right? It's not like I'm going to be adding any new or valuable insight or critique, but what I realized that I wanted to talk about and could talk about at least was just the experience of reading it cover to cover, whether or not I recommend it, what I might recommend instead, and just the general experience. So of course this video is not going, I'm not going to go into specific books of the Bible, although I will obviously reference all the way throughout. But yeah, like the general things, other than talking about my experience reading cover to cover, I have some specific things that I want to go into. But before I start, I'm going to try and just do every disclaimer that I can think of at the start so that I don't kind of interrupt the flow later on. So although I chose to read the Bible for literary reasons, really inspired by one, How to Read Literature Like a Professor, where the author talked about the fact that really the two foundational texts or bodies of work in Western literature are the Bible and Shakespeare, and so filling out my knowledge of the Western canon, it just seemed kind of necessary to go back and read it. And two, a kind of thought or quote that really stuck into my ear was something that Chris Vere at Leaf by Leaf said, which was that some books are talked about so much that we kind of feel like we've already read them. And for me, I feel like that was most true about the Bible, which kind of segues into number 3, being that the generation that I am, and kind of coming up in the internet age, the rhetoric or discourse around the Bible really was like my introduction to it. Of course, I have parents who are personally but not actively religious, and I'm aware of the religious communities, but it was something that was maybe just taken for granted or not really talked about. My first introduction to talking about the Bible was seeing the kind of Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris atheism kind of fighting back against the Bible, and talking about the logical fallacies and the questionable morals according to them. And then the rhetoric was really, a lot of the rhetoric back from the religious side was people responding to them, and that sort of clash. And so that was where I started. That was the kind of a priori. And it didn't, which is what I believe reinforced this idea of not really needing to read the Bible, because obviously there are factual errors and so on. And, obviously we have kind of science that has talked about why this is not a kind of solid science textbook. But the point was that it just never occurred to me that, hey, like, maybe I should just read it, just to sort of know what I'm talking about, to try and inform myself. And so that was kind of the impetus of wanting to go through and be a bit of a completionist, to go and read the whole thing, so that if I wanted to engage in a sort of dialogue or conversation with somebody, I kind of actually knew what I was talking about. But still, I decided to read it for literary reasons. So although it's very obvious there's a lot of laws, there's a lot of ways in which you're meant to set up a society and ways that you're meant to act. Of course I read those, and they are fundamental parts of the Bible, but they weren't what I was going and looking for, and it's also not what I'm planning on bringing here. So I'm not going to do any preaching for or against the Bible in terms of the kind of religious or the moral side. But the fact that it is still there is really important. And an example that I wanted to talk about and start with is the conjugation of R and an with words that start with H. So a kind of quirk of the language. So I read the King James Version. And a quirk of the language that's a little bit different to modern English is that words that start with H, you conjugate the R to be an, and so you would read a sentence like an holy place, and I never got over that. I always kind of like just had a bump in my reading, and it just disrupted the flow. And from like page 1 to the end, I was never able to just, like, I said to myself, I'll just pretend that the H is silent, and so I'll read it as an holy place or whatever. And I would keep telling myself that I will do that, but every time I saw it, I got caught up, and it just like kind of disrupted the flow. What unfortunately didn't was that pretty early on, the Bible just flat out establishes that there are so many anti-female and anti-women perspectives that really, honestly, by the end, you kind of just are reading them and you're like, oh, okay, and you're skipping over. But I do want to sort of, acknowledge and check privilege and just say that, like, I was obviously able to tolerate those things because it wasn't something that was personally affecting me. And even though I would read sections where I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm more of a sinner than saint in this regard, the fact that the anti-female rhetoric in the Bible was so ubiquitous that you were able to sort of, I was able to sort of drown it out and just think about it as your kind of racist or sexist family member who's just kind of going crazy and you just politely ignore them. For me, it felt like I really wanted to mention that I was getting caught up on this R and conjugation for the whole Bible, but just because of how ubiquitous the kind of male-centric, misogynistic views of the Bible are, the only way you can continue is if you just sort of let it wash over you. And like, I know I'm doing a whole lot of disclaiming before I start. I'm sorry this video is almost like 10 minutes long already, but I do think it's really important because I don't want to come across as too positive, to be honest, with the Bible, even though for the most part, once I get all the disclaiming done, I'm just going to talk about stuff that I loved in the Bible. But that's something that I just think is important to notice because, or important to note, because if somebody does decide to commit to a cover-to-cover read, you're just going to be confronted with that very, very often. An example that stood out to me because it, not ruined, but it really just sort of soured what was almost an absolutely perfect book, being Ecclesiastes, is Ecclesiastes 7:25 and 26, which is, I applied mine heart to know and to search and to seek out wisdom and the reason of things and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death the woman, whose heart is snares and nets and her hands as bands, Whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. And it's just something where you're on such a good streak, and the whole of Ecclesiastes is great, and then there's just those two sections that are just like, oh, you really had to make that comment, and then you continue going on. But anyway, hopefully with all those disclaimers done, TLDR, I'm going to talk about the literary things that I like, but I'm not planning on preaching for or against the moral or the religious perspectives. Anyway, let's get started. Let's get started 11 minutes in. The experience of reading the Bible cover to cover. Was it worth it? Mostly no, but kind of yes. The reason I say kind of yes is because, firstly, bragging rights. I am easily going to spend the next 30 or 40 years reading or just telling people that I read the Bible cover to cover. And as a completionist, I do feel glad that I sort of did that and I finished it. And, I didn't kind of intentionally ignore or have any gaps in my knowledge. Also, there were some sections that I think really benefited from the fact that I had done the work and gone and read all of the history sections. And I'll talk about that when I start talking about David and about the Psalms. The reason why it's mostly no is because if your image of the Bible is things like Genesis, is things like the first chapter of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel basically trips balls and sees biblically accurate angels. If your idea of the Bible is the Proverbs that you've read, unfortunately, a lot of the Bible is not like that. And I think the big sort of because we start with Genesis, which is one of the best books in the Bible, and you're soaring so high, it is just every single page, every sentence is dripping with symbolic richness. Really like the binding of Isaac from Abraham and Lot and his daughters in the cave. It's all this like really complex construction or composition, and Genesis is a book that I, without a doubt, will go back to reread again. You lead into Exodus, and we get introduced to Moses, who brings the Israelites out of Egypt, or the Jews out of Egypt, and he escapes. And then, kind of around Exodus 20, the entire book just goes doosh, and you get a extremely detailed description of how to build the Ark of the Covenant. And at that point, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is what the Bible is going to be. And it is because the Bible is not, 1,100 pages of Genesis. It is laws. It is history. It is all of that stuff. It is kind of the history of Israel and the history of Judaism, obviously in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, it's different. It starts talking about Jesus. But in that sense, if you really wanted to just read the most symbolically rich, literature-relevant, or literature-relevant parts of the Bible, my suggestion is read Genesis. Maybe if you're feeling brave, power through and read the whole first 5 books. So after Genesis, we've got Exodus, and then Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So that's the Torah. And the reason why that I recommend to read those 5 is just because that's the story of from kind of the start of creation to the death of Moses. And then in the history section, you are going to have a lot, but really I think that if you read the story of David, then that is the most kind of central through line. He was the 3rd king of Israel, but he was really like the big dog. And I feel like David was very, very central to the history section. And maybe if you're feeling it, you can sort of expand out to David's peripherals. So pre-David, you get Samuel and Saul, and so you might be reading them, and it might not be as interesting as you would like, but you kind of know that they are just leading into David. And after David, you get, yes, Absalom, but really Solomon. And so if I was to suggest out of the history section, just kind of the essential books. It would be the books of Kings, including Samuel, like so Samuel 1, Samuel 2, Kings 1, Kings 2. We lead on. We have some extra stuff. We have people after Solomon, but really where I think the Bible goes just like basically skyrockets back to 100 in terms of quality is when you hit the book of Job and you get into the first of 5 books of poetry of the Bible. Job. So even though my favorites of those books were Job and the Song of Solomon, I think all 5 of those books are worth reading. They are all beautiful. The kind of topics that were explored in Job, Job talks about what's it called, theodicy, or it's questioning or musing on why there is evil in the world if God is all powerful and all loving, and it's the trials and the tribulations and the tests of Job. We get into Psalms, and the Psalms I found were really interesting because I might have been in a unique position having read the Psalms after having read the whole story of David, because many of the Psalms were written by David, and it kind of painted this really interesting image of this sort of poet king. He starts as a harpist and as like a shepherd, and then he slays Goliath, which is what everybody knows about David. But then he goes on to be this big king, and reading the Psalms kind of reminded me of that other kind of prior dimension of David. And I really liked as well that a lot of David's Psalms, if not all of them, are written in the first person. So it kind of has a different prose voice to the style of some of the other Psalms that were not written by David. We get into Proverbs, which is pretty much as it is. I feel like I detected a hint of that it was written in the voice of King Solomon. And maybe I can go and check or confirm if they are the Proverbs of Solomon, but at the very least, Ecclesiastes felt like it was very definitely written by. So the Proverbs are the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, and so Ecclesiastes also. This was cool because it was signed by the preacher, but it's written in the exact same prose voice and prose style as the Proverbs, and so it very much leads you to believe that it is written by Solomon, and I just assumed that it was written by Solomon without having done research, but then I went and looked up, and they were talking, there was some scholarly insights talking about how some of the loan words or some of the vocabulary that were used in Ecclesiastes were words that were introduced in an era that was later than Solomon's expected, the time that we believe that he lived. And so maybe there's some ambiguity as to whether it was written by a later person and written in the style or to emulate Solomon. And so I thought that was really cool, like just from a literary perspective. And also the fact that it's signed the preacher just gave me Dune vibes, thinking about some of the later books. After Ecclesiastes, we get into the 5th book of poetry, the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, which really, if I was to just say, here's one thing to read from the Bible that will be worth it because it is unlike anything else in the Bible. It is an erotic poem, basically, and it is really, really beautiful. And I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but I'll quickly use the pivot of beautiful language to talk about the King James Version. So even though, like I said, there were key books of the Bible that I think were much more worth reading from a literary perspective as others, as you can see, there pretty much was no book of the Bible where I didn't at least have some annotations. And I can really honestly say that I believe what saved a cover-to-cover read of the Bible for me was the fact that I was reading the King James Version, because the language really, really is beautiful. although I haven't done any extensive reading of other translations, and I'm definitely, like I said, I'm not ever going to cover the Bible again. I have read, like translations and comparisons of specific sections, and I would say that I think for the poetry sections, I really, really loved how it was done in the King James Version. And for things like the Book of Job and for Song of Solomon or the Song of Songs, I'd be really happy to get, some recommendations of other translations that you liked. I just found these to be so beautiful in that section. Moving on, in terms of the prophets. So after that, the last section has three major prophets, being Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Jeremiah, funny story, was almost going to be my name, but my mum ended up deciding against it, which, I kind of like the name Jeremiah, but then reading the Bible and reading that there is a book of the Bible called The Lamentations of Jeremiah, I was like, do I want to be named after a person who is, known for being a bemoaner? So, maybe I got lucky with that. But, with those three, those are the three major prophets, and then we have sort of 12 minor prophets. And my favorite of those from a literary or a symbolic perspective was definitely Daniel. There are some stunning scenes of Daniel interpreting dreams that the king Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadrezzar, because there's some ambiguity in the spelling of the name, but it is referring to the same person. And there's also a scene, this is just wild. This is why, these are the things that I'd never heard about, but it was really a treat to find them in the Bible. There's a scene in the book of Daniel where these prophets that are friends of Daniel are found kind of worshipping the God of Israel, and the king is like, oh, nah, that's not on. And so he boils this, he fires up this furnace or this kiln, and basically chucks them into the kiln, but then the king looks inside the kiln and sees the three of them and an angel walking around, and they just walk out of the fire. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. This is just a really cool thing to read. And so Daniel, and again, like I kind of mentioned, the start of Ezekiel had some really rich symbolism that was reminiscent of sort of Genesis and early Exodus and whatnot. The rest of the Bibles, maybe the only thing, we do have Jonah, of course, the story of Jonah getting swallowed by the whale, which I was very surprised was very short. There's only 4 chapters in the book of Jonah. But then we just go through, we end up with Malachi as the last of the minor prophets, and that is the end of the Old Testament. And we move on. So just really quickly, is there anything else I wanted to talk about in the Old Testament? One thing that I thought was interesting. This is not correct from a religious, theological perspective, because, the whole early Testament is stressing that the God of Israel is the one true God, and that is the one, and you should not worship false idols. In a Borges essay, where I believe he was talking about the Argentine voice, he was talking about trying to write a poem that captured or conveyed his homeland, and all of them just seemed too obvious or too touristy until he had this revelation that the Quran never mentions camels. And it was because for Muhammad, camels were so normal and so ubiquitous in everyday life that they didn't even seem worthy of mentioning. And so the Quran has such a strong kind of Arabic or Islamic flavor because of that contributed to having that fact of not mentioning camels contributed to that fact. And so in the same way, trying to use this sort of backward reasoning, the Bible, the Old Testament, spends so long talking about other gods and assuring you that they're not real, they're the one true God. It just made me think that well, obviously there are other gods. Like, obviously, not literally, but obviously in that era there were a lot of gods. And, I know that sounds obvious, but it's just that similar thing where, like, the fundamental thing was, what am I trying to say? Like, it's not... It's one of those things where if there was actually only one God at that time, then there wouldn't have been a need to talk about the other gods. And so I started to see the composition of the Bible as like the book from the God that made it. And I was imagining, I was like, what would a Philistine Bible be like? Or, what would Jezebel have read from? And just thinking of all of these other gods like Baal and Moloch and stuff. And again, I know that this is sacrilegious from a kind of religious perspective, but just from a literary perspective, that was something that was so obvious. I'm like, okay, you're telling me that there's only one true God, but you're spending so much time talking about false idols and worshipping these other gods that it's just obvious to me that there were in this time other gods that were being worshipped at the same level as the God of Israel. And yeah, so I think that might be everything. There is something I will get to, a topic of getting away from the Bible or like biblical allusions, but I'll quickly talk about New Testament. So, New Testament is the introduction of our man Jesus Christ, and we start off with the four Gospels. The Gospels according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In my opinion, all of those Gospels, three of those Gospels are worth reading. Mark kind of felt like a less fleshed out Matthew. Matthew felt like the most just kind of to the point facts, like, yeah, here's the story of Jesus born, we've got the three wise men, and then like there were different perspectives from Luke and John. Mark just felt like a bit more like Matthew, but not as fleshed out. But if you've read all three of them, you may as well read all four. Like, it's not gonna take you that much longer if you've committed to reading the three of them. But what I like about the four Gospels is that, there are things that are, there are differences. There are things that are left out. There are some things that are changed. So only in the very first Gospel of Matthew does Pontius Pilate wash his hands of it. And in the other ones, he doesn't do that action. He doesn't do that action of washing his hands and saying, no, okay, it's up to you. I've let it. I don't find anything wrong with this guy, but the Jews want him dead. So yeah. And I believe it's also in the Gospel of Saint Matthew is the only one with the three wise men coming to see Jesus. But the Gospel of Saint Luke is the only one that talks about John the Baptist as being a family member or like a cousin of Jesus Christ. And getting back into what I was talking about with Solomon and with the prose style, I really like that you can tell very different prose styles in this book. And a bit of a funny difference that I want to read out to you is the first sentence of the Gospel according to St. Luke versus the first sentence of the Gospel according to St. John. So here's St. Luke. For as much as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed. So, let me jump to the Gospel according to St. John to show you the difference. The first sentence. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so, if you're interested in reading and exploring different prose styles, that was something that I found I liked quite a lot, actually, about some of the books of the Bible. After we get through the Gospels, it's pretty consistent for the rest of the Bible because they are mostly letters written by Paul. But then we have a kind of hard cut to the end, the book of Revelation, which again is sort of the rambunctious finale or the closer of the Bible, and gets back into a lot of the Isaiah style doom saying and so on. You know, we know a lot of stories about all of like the plagues and everything, the seven seals breaking and so on. I don't want to spoil anything else. I really would recommend just going and reading Revelation. And yeah, I think that might be... So I am going to talk about what I mentioned, getting away from the Bible, but just taking a quick look at the notes, I think that's everything. Yeah, the last thing that I wanted to talk about on the topic of getting away from it, or what biblical allusions will do for me. So before having read the Bible, if something is used as a reference to the Bible, it had this sort of foggy, hazy, misty perception in my head where, you know, firstly, I thought that a lot more of the Bible was Genesis, kind of Ezekiel, Revelation sort of imagery, but also I had just associated it with like, oh, you know, you're smart, or you're a good writer if you reference the Bible. And even though some references do still work, and you know, I won't deny that I kind of felt giddy reading, I believe it was either Judges or it was the first book of Samuel, you know, where I'm seeing Ahab, Ishmael, and Elijah all on screen at the same time, and I'm kind of getting throwbacks to one of my favorite books. I will admit that now I don't know how I feel about biblical allegories or reading them or something like that, because I've done the work to go and read the Bible. So now a reference to the Bible would just be like, oh yeah, I get that. You know, I can't imagine myself wanting to go and read something like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or anything that's a really strong just parable of the Bible, because it feels like those are things that you would read if you haven't read the Bible, and they're just, but I have read the Bible, and so now I'm like, oh yeah, I've done that work. And so I do, you know, I still do enjoy a good reference, but I think that one thing that might happen, I'm guessing, is that kind of my standard for what I will want out of a biblical reference is probably going to change or develop. And so I think something that I really liked was, again, I'm taking this from How to Read Literature Like a Professor, I really liked that in one of, I really like the example of how in Song of Solomon, the Toni Morrison book, I believe that one of the characters' name is Pilate, because they're named after Pontius Pilate, but it was just because the father, or I'm guessing the father, was just so devoutly religious that they just opened up the book and just pointed, and that was what the name was going to be. And that, I think that's a really clever sort of warping or adaptation on a kind of biblical thing. And so that's still, I think, really cool, but I'm not necessarily going to just be kind of like, oh yeah, that was a fun reference, or oh yeah, it's nice to know that that's a biblical allegory, because yeah, I've done the hard work of going and actually reading the Bible. So and so that's on biblical allusions. But on this idea of getting away from it, again, I know that this is so obvious, but the Bible was and is so influential on Western literature and just the way that we think of a story, that I find it so like what you think of as common sense really come from a specific set of stories that, you know, that existed. They're not like kind of fundamental natural laws. And I'm really, really interested in finding now other formulas and other things that could inform the way, you know, a story is constructed or a story is paced. I really liked, for example, reading the Bhagavad Gita and this sort of story of, you know, Arjuna being the prince who needs to go and kind of fight his family members, but then you have the humble carriage driver Krishna, who is just kind of providing wisdom and insight along the way. And that's, you know, that's a model for a story idea. I think that could have been something that might have been something like Driving Miss Daisy as well, even though obviously Driving Miss Daisy has a lot of racial things, so it's not exactly the same. But the point that I'm trying to make is that I'm really glad that I've read the Bible now, because now I'm seeing that a good story isn't like necessarily a kind of fixed, objectively true thing. It is coming from a tradition that is very, very like specific, and it comes from a particular book or set of books, and you are able, if you want, to move away from it. You don't need to take them as like absolute truths that this is how a story needs to be structured. Which I know that this isn't revolutionary. I know that this is what a lot of people were trying to do in sort of, like more postmodern stuff. But yeah, that was just something that I feel like I now, rather than just kind of think about, have thought about, or have heard, like I feel like I know and I feel it, and I'm now more equipped to recognize it. And yeah, needless to say, I'm very excited still to go ahead and read like the Mahabharata. I want to read the tale of Genji, and so on and so forth. I know this video has been long. I want to thank you so much for sticking around and actually indulging in me for talking for nearly 40 minutes about the Holy Bible by King James Version. And thank you again for tolerating all of the disclaimers. I wanted to talk about the things that I loved about the Bible, but I needed to just mention that there were a lot of important disclaimers and roadblocks that you will come across if you decide to read it cover to cover. My parting words are, again, my favorite books were Genesis, Exodus, except the IKEA manual on the Ark of the Covenant, all of the books of poetry, the story of David, and the Gospels according to the four saints, and the book of Daniel. Go and read the book of Daniel as well. Again, thank you so much. If you're still here, you're an absolute legend. And just for those of you who are still here, I can give you a teaser. My next video will also be a book review. I am going to be talking, not review. I keep saying that they're reviews, but they're not reviews because I'm not trying to put objective quality on them. Anyway, I'm rambling. My next video will be thoughts and comments on Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev. Thank you again for like the 50th time now for watching, and I'll see you in that video.